Hello everyone, my name is Caden Calloway and we're checking out here the time lapse from the sculpting I did on the character HEPHAESTUS from God of War 3. He was a really interesting character to get to work on. Izzy did the concept for this guy. He's supposed to be a character who basically made weapons for Kratos and other gods in Olympus, and from what I understand, mainly Zeus. He did the lightning bolt from him, I think, in mythology. But he's a really mangled up character in prison. The idea is he's been forced into a cave, from what I believe, and that's where his prison was. And so he was kind of like all crippled and whatnot because he's crunched up into this small little area. So the idea, as you can see, is a pretty mangled guy. So a lot of his structure, it was tough for him. You'll see throughout this, his face changes a lot because it was trying to get across his really strong structure of the skull still, but it's all contorted and twisted around with his messed up eye and his broken nose and his lips off to the side, because basically the right side of his face is as if he had a stroke and didn't work too well. The hands on HEPHAESTUS actually had a lot of fun on. Here I've already done a decent amount of the base volumes. I'll block a lot of that in a program called Maya, where I'll get the major volumes. And here I'm just like getting the key points, like where the knuckles come through and the tendons are pulling across. And at the base of the hand, it's making the pads of the fingers, making it feel like there's thickness there. And with hands, there's a lot of interesting forms here. They're actually pretty complex. So you got to make them feel solid. You got to make sure you have your bony points, like with each of the knuckles on the fingers where the bones comes through, and then making it feel like the tendons are pulling back through the hand. Here we are. Right now his face looks kind of mangled. I've already started like trying to block in like where the eyelids go around his eyes and getting the ears in. A lot of times I try not to get too caught up, and if it's not looking quite right, I'll try and just work through the character, and gradually things will be revealed to me, like, oh, this just doesn't look right, you know, like here I'm trying to get the cheekbone to come through correctly. And what was tough about this guy was, with a skull, it's really not going to change a whole lot. Your jaw might be able to be crooked, which you can see here, but your cheekbones really, unless they're bashed in, aren't going to move a whole lot. So it can be tough to make it feel like his eye, for example, has had a stroke, and like sculpt one side or the other and keep it feeling solid, but yet really contorted. And this is actually a challenge for me, because most characters we do are pretty straightforward faces. And just working through this character, I can't tell you how many times I've probably changed stuff on his face. As you see, I just keep on going off it and coming back to it because I needed a fresh look at it. We have him in this pose because a lot of characters will make it a T-pose, what we call it, where their arms are straight out and they're standing up. But because this guy is primarily already in this pose and he's hunched over, they allowed me to sculpt him in this pose, and this is how we actually set him up for the animators. Because if we were to sculpt him in T-pose, then he would have to bend his arms a lot more than he was set up to be, which can sometimes make for some complicated deformation around the arms. So for me, getting to sculpt in this was really nice because I could already sculpt in some of the rhythms between like the different forms, from his shoulders to his biceps to his arms, and it really allowed to get more into the character, because sculpting in T-pose sometimes can be kind of painful because it's not very dynamic and very stiff, whereas like something like this has already a gesture to it and you can kind of work off of it. Here I'm working on his torso, and I really like this guy and how he's all twisted up and contorted and kind of like emaciated. He probably is not eating too much down there, and so like you'll see a lot of skin pulling, like from someone who's older and really thin. So he was a lot of fun to do, and you can see his rib cages are all twisted over to the side. So I really tried to make it feel like his ribs were pulled over to the side, but yet his body was kind of still central. So you'll see like on the back right there, his lat is kind of pulling across further, and on the left side it's a little more compact and compressed. And just trying to sell this idea of him being really contorted. And if you check out the concept, you'll see he's really all twisted up and gnarly, and is a lot of fun to work on this guy. Here, I already blocked in like where his knees would be, where his quads would be and his calves. The idea is he's been sitting a lot, so his legs aren't going to be terribly strong looking. You can see they're kind of saggy there and flat on top, so they're not terribly full of, say, water, or not very exercised too much, so they're not going to be looking too strong. So here, since he's been sitting and he sits in lava all the time, I wanted to make it look like he's had scar tissue building up over his knees and down on his lower legs, which later I'll work on. But basically the idea is that they've really been chewed up and aren't looking very good, really. But as always, like all other areas, the idea is you got to make sure your structure underneath that is solid before you can start adding those things, or otherwise it might not feel quite right. Here, just going back over, basically this guy was so big on screen, I had to make sure I really spent the time on the small stuff, and I really wanted to make his hands feel really high res and solid, so I spent a lot of time on these. His face and his hands, I probably spent more time on this character than any, because he was always working on stuff in front of the screen with his hands. So I had to make sure that they felt really realistic and really detailed. So majority of my time, I'd say, was spent here and on his face. I looked at a lot of reference of older guys, older thin guys that they look like maybe they worked a lot or maybe been out in the sun a lot. So you get that kind of leathery feel. So here I was trying to sell like those like knuckles aren't, if you look at someone who's younger or maybe isn't outside a whole lot, their knuckles and skin, that kind of is soft feeling, and I want it to feel like it's really worn and used and abused. And once I started texturing it, I could really sell that, because I could make them look all super dirty from being in the cave and make them feel a lot older and really push the idea of it being wrinkly and messed up. I probably had more fun working on this guy. He's probably one of the most fun characters for me to work on. I really enjoyed, like, it's funny to say, but just working on this hand here, just adding all the subtlety to it and really making it feel like it exists. And I think hands can be really, like if you get good hands on a character, they're one of those things that people sometimes don't take enough time on, and it's something we notice when it's not right, because we see so much of them. And it can be, hands can be, next to the face, can be one of the most expressive things we use to talk. And so making the hands feel really dynamic and solid and hitting those, like, the planes that make up the hand and the opposing curves from like the finger pads below to like the planes of the bones on top of the finger can really sell a character. And giving the animators the ability to work with nice hands, they can really work through a lot of how the character expresses himself. And so for me, the hands are one of the biggest parts of characters when I work on something that's, especially when I pose stuff. Hands are some of my favorite things to do. Most characters, when we're working on them, we think about their history so that you can think about why they are the way they are. So for like the Cerberus, for example, like he was living in Hades and was emaciated and probably fighting all the time, so his skin and body's going to feel different, you know, because he'll probably be strong because he's always on his feet. Whereas something like this guy who's in a cave and probably thinks a lot and just sits there and makes weapons because he's in prison, I generally think about how he's probably a sad guy, you know, he's lost his wife and whatnot, so when you sculpt that kind of into the character, like the face, I kind of think about those things and how his eyes would sit and how his brows would sit. But you only want to do so much of that because animators will do a lot more of that. But at the same time, you want to put a little bit of life into them and character into them, because everyone is going to be different. Even when they're just sitting there staring, everyone has some sort of history or background to think about. And we kind of sculpt a bit of that into them. And especially with this guy, I had a lot of fun because he already had so much character already just by looking at him that I wanted to make sure that was captured in what I made. Here, just working on the muscles pulling from underneath the lats over to the ribs. People that are really thin, you'll see these a lot, especially if anyone that's kind of active or works out but yet is really thin, you really see these kind of muscles pulling through. There's not a lot of whole fat on top, so you're going to see the muscles, those little ones coming from underneath the lats over to the ribs. Here I'm just working on like pores and things, wrinkles, like very tertiary like forms on the character. I don't always sculpt this stuff, but because he's so high res, I wanted to sculpt everything on him. So for him, just looked at reference of older guys and just sculpting in here, just used a basic alpha to block in some pores, but then just went over with my brush and pushed and pulled skin direction so it felt like the skin was moving across a certain way like it really would, to help sell this idea of it being fleshy. The more you can add of this kind of secondary and tertiary forms makes it feel more or less how you want. If you want it to be really tight skin or fleshy skin, and for this case I wanted this guy to feel like he had kind of loose skin in areas but at the same time really strong forearms. So it was a nice practice of blending the two. Here I'm just doing the same thing as like I did on the arm, just going over, trying to add that tertiary forms of like small little wrinkles and skin pulling here like across the ribs. I didn't want his abs at all to feel strong. As you can see, I was trying to add weight to his lower abdomen like it's just being compressed down there, because he probably wouldn't be using it too much. His ribs, kind of like someone who hasn't ate much, are going to be the primary form there, and the rest of his skin's just kind of fold up. So that was the idea here, and really he was going to bend over forward, so you really wouldn't even see it too much. The feet, a lot like the hands, I had a good time on because they are another example of, you can really make them feel solid by just having those tendons pop through and have these strong lines going into softer forms, and they can be really interesting to work on to make them feel like they exist. And here around his ankle, the idea is that he had a foot, I forget what they call it, but basically they don't work anymore, and it swells up. And from people who sometimes sit a lot or can't use them, a lot of blood goes down to their feet and it can swell up and get all nasty. And plus him sitting in the lava can really mess it up. A lot of a personality can come through in how the character like sits there and just has a default look. We don't want to sculpt too much personality into them because the animators will give a lot more to it, but you don't want to make them seem totally lifeless. So we try and like sculpt a bit of personality into just their default like look on their face maybe, or how they just like hold themselves. Like anyone that, if you look at anybody, everyone has a certain personality to them, even when they just sit there and look. So for this guy, for example, I kind of wanted to make him feel almost sad, because he's just in prison basically working by himself, and his wife's been taken away from him, and he's not doing too well. So for him, I kind of wanted his eyes already look a little bit sad and not doing too well, because that's just kind of was his character, and for his face to feel kind of depressed in a sense. Here you can see I was masking off areas to try and get that jawline correct, and I wanted to move it out a bit but not affect the rest. Getting that jawline is actually really important to make that structure feel solid. If you can get that jaw and to make it feel like the bone is there, and then how that jaw goes up into the cheekbone, it's that big plane there that can really sell the shape of the face. And then from there, it's just having that skin's like pulling down. And here we jump forward a bit. I've added a lot of secondary forms already. I got the structure how I wanted, and now I'm just going over basically making the different weights in different areas of the skin, so you can see like where it bunches up a bit around by the nose, where we call it like kind of like the laugh line, where that skin can bunch between the lips and the cheekbones. That thickness and volumes and how the wrinkles look is going to be different than, say, where that skin is going up from the upper lip into the nose. So you got to really pay attention to like how the different weights of the skin feel to really sell a character's face, because the skin's going to be a lot thinner where like the forehead is and where the cheekbone is than, say, where how thick the skin is where the lips are, and how thick it is from the lips to the teeth is a different thickness than from the cheekbone skin where the skin layer is down to the actual bone itself, and same with the forehead. So you got to really pay attention to these things and how skin builds up to make it feel believable. And here, working on his teeth is a perfect example of having really gnarly teeth can help sell a character, and I thought his teeth were a big part of him, so I took a lot of time on his teeth were missing. He doesn't have dental care, so they're all jacked and gnarly, and he never brushes his teeth, obviously. So to sell this character, I really wanted to make his teeth feel jacked up, and I think it really helped out a lot, actually. And there he is, spinning around. This is the final model. And I guess I hope you guys liked this video of Hephaestus, and hope you guys enjoy God of War 3 art book.